Hello, and welcome to the Into the Abyss podcast. I'm doing another solo episode. I just wanted to mention that for those listening to the audio, that I'm also making this a YouTube video with lots of visuals. Most of the visuals are just quotes and pictures of people that I'm quoting. But I also have a few graphics that I put together to help visualize some of the concepts I'm working through here. The most important is what I'm calling a spectrum of materiality, but I'll describe it as well. So I'll try to make it so that you can still get everything just from the audio, but I wanted to mention that the video is out there in case you want to check it out. This episode will again cover some ideas I've been having in response to things that I've been reading recently. That includes a lot of stuff, but mostly 3 books. One I've been reading for a book club that I'm in, and I actually nominated this book, and it's Daniel Dennett's book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds. The second is by an Australian philosopher named Elizabeth Grosz, who I hadn't heard of until just recently, but her work is quite interesting, and her book is The Incorporeal, Ontology, Ethics, and the Limits of Materialism. Those 2 books are quite recent. The third book is a much older classic work, Ethics, by Baruch Spinoza, written in the 17th century. The common thread through all of these is the topic of substance generally, and material substance more particularly. This episode will be quite philosophical, but as I usually do, I want to relate it to theological concepts. So for those of you more interested in the theological side of things, which will probably be my fellow churchgoers, I'm going to bookend all of this with ideas relating to substance and material, relating substance and material to their religious corollaries in matter and spirit. How should we think about those categories? And characteristically, I'm not really going to be conclusive about that because I think it's possible to organize our thinking about all this in a few different ways that are workable. A spirit, for example, whether we think of it as something material or immaterial, you could look at that either way, depending on what you're after. So let's dig in. To start getting into this, I'd like to propose the question, what is material? Okay, and I think this is something maybe just bringing up some examples will help with, and it's something that it makes sense to do by degrees. So we'll start at the macroscopic scale, things that I think would be pretty uncontroversially material. So things like rocks, tables, and chairs, macroscopic objects that we don't even really have to think about reflectively to have to deal with. They're things that we can stub our toes on, bang our heads on, so we have to pay attention to them just by living our daily lives. I think these would be pretty uncontroversially considered material. And any other macroscopic object like that, things that resist our pressure as we touch them, are pretty obviously material. We can expand that a little bit further to things that may not be quite as obvious, but I think most people would pretty easily consider material. So like gases, like the air that we breathe, and the wind that blows on us. Wind isn't something that we can see, but we can see the effects of wind. We can see wind moving things. We can feel the wind on our face. We can feel changes in pressure. We can feel air as we breathe it in and blow it out. And that's something that we can see, okay, that's something material as well, even though it's not as obviously some type of definite object. It's some type of fluid, even though it's more rarefied, interacts with other material things so that it is pretty clearly material as well. So those are things that just being human without the aid of any special instruments, without the aid of anything scientific, is pretty clearly material. Then there are things that maybe we would need the aid of instruments to be able to perceive. So things that are microscopic, like cells and bacteria, those seem to be pretty clearly material as well. Even though we don't see them directly, it's still, so a bacteria, for instance, if we look at it under a microscope, it's magnified, but we're still seeing it in the way that we would normally see things, even if it is magnified. So you look at a bacteria cell, you can say, okay, it's an object, even though I may not to be able to, my sense of touch and sight are not don't have high enough resolution to be able to sense them individually. With these expanded abilities with our instruments, we can see that these are objects in the world, that they have effects on us, they can make us sick, and these are pretty clearly material as well. As we start to abstract away from that a little bit and get deeper into our scientific methods, we start to rely on models for things. If we're thinking of individual molecules, so some organic molecule like an adenosine triphosphate, we have a model of what that looks like and how the functional groups rotate on their bonds and how they work. But it's very much a model at that point. It's not something that we're really looking at, or when we make these figures with diagrams, I think, well, hopefully we understand that's not really what it looks like in the traditional sense, that we're just looking at it and seeing it. These are things that we have to infer based on experiment and kind of reproduce in the model in a way that we can understand it. It's for that benefit. And also, in physics, we have concepts of fields, electric fields, gravitational fields, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic waves. And those, we can draw pictures of them. We can draw field lines coming from source charges and things like that. But those also seem to be for our benefit, for our way of conceiving them. They're not things that we normally see. An electric field or a magnetic field you could see, for example, with iron filaments, but that's not seeing the field itself. It's seeing the effects of it. And then as we start to get into the levels of individual atoms and molecular bonds, and we're looking at orbitals and the results of calculations with quantum mechanics and the Schrödinger equation, and seeing what individual orbitals look like and how they form molecular orbitals and how those electrons would be distributed in their probability clouds. We're definitely in the level of models as well. Now, I think that most people who get involved in those things, like me, and people who are learning the science and working on it, either at the level of science or engineering, would still consider those things material. And I think that makes sense. There are more degrees removed from our most immediate experience, but with the aid of instruments and making chains of inferences, we can see the material effects that they have, and that basically they're they're needed for explanations to explain our material world. So we want to include them in our material picture. Abstracting even further from those kind of models, we start to get into the rules, the laws that we set up in our sciences, especially in physics, to explain the patterns that we see in the material world. So if we think about these fundamental equations that we would learn in physics, F equals ma equals mc squared, with just Newtonian mechanics, and then Einsteinian relativity, Maxwell's equations, the Schrödinger equation, the Einstein field equations. These are mathematical objects, but and they are really indispensable for us to be able to explain and understand the material world. Are they material themselves? I think that can break down in different ways. I think if we think about it, which we wouldn't necessarily have to, but if we're getting into these type of conversations where we're considering, okay, what is material? How much does the material encompass? Are these laws that transcend the material, or are they somehow embedded in the material world as well? Or are they in some sense material objects themselves? Are they forms that are instantiated in individual material objects and phenomena? So that's the kind of question. As we get to that level of abstraction, that's where it becomes a little bit more of a gray area, but it's still well within the realm of science. It's not getting into anything supernatural. It's just a question of how do we catalog this in our material toolbox. Still, when we're talking about the laws of physics and the mathematical expressions and things like that, I think that's either more of a gray area or not something that as many people think about. Where it starts to get more obvious that there's some type of distinction here is when we get into what we could either say is a soul, spirit, or mind. And that could either be, in the case of a spirit or soul, that's something that would seem to be supernatural. So is there a spirit animating our bodies? Is it something that persists after death? Is it something, some people have talked about seeing a spirit actually leave a body after death. And what is the nature of that? Is the spirit something that is immaterial? And then, of course, there's a question of, does that even exist? And a lot of, under materialism, generally that's considered to be answered negatively, that there's not even a spirit or a soul to consider there. But in terms of the mind, that's something that seems pretty clearly to exist. That there is kind of an extreme view that would deny that, but I would say most people would say, yeah, there's a mind, and that the mind is something distinct from the brain. We could say the brain is the hardware, the mind is the software. But then, what is the nature of the mind? Is that something that's material? And I think that's probably where, at least in philosophy, where one of the big breakdowns would be between the corporeal and the incorporeal, the material and the immaterial. Now, just to step back for a second and talk about definitions. I didn't start out with definitions, and what is material? I didn't give a definition for it, or what is immaterial? I didn't give a definition for that. And makes me think of like a Socratic dialogue where Socrates will ask, what is such and such? What is love? What is justice? And his interlocutor will start listing off examples of this and that, and Socrates will say, well, you've only given examples of this thing. You haven't really defined what it is. I realize that, but I also don't really know how to define it, and so I think just giving examples is a good place to start off, or at least this spectrum that I've kind of given of what's obviously material and where it starts to get a little bit more fuzzy. And I guess what I'm trying to generate from that is a sense for it. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, in contrast to this Socratic practice of giving strict definitions for things, well, usually it would fail with Socrates anyway. They wouldn't be able to give a definition often. But Ludwig Wittgenstein really was skeptical of the possibility of really giving strict definitions for many things, because definitions often either include too much, or they exclude things that we have a sense that should be included in a definition. So, he gives the example of a game that, if you give some definition of a game, a lot of things that don't fit that definition you would still want to include in a game because it covers a broad range. But there's kind of what he calls family resemblances in these things. And so that's kind of what I've tried to put together here in describing material and immaterial, thinking, okay, yeah, this here, these rocks, tables, and trees, these are pretty obviously material. The mind, the soul, if it exists, maybe not. It kind of generates that basic sense of what we're talking about here. Now, having put all that out there, I'd like to think about several different ways that we could break this down. And in a kind of extreme version, we could say that all of this stuff is material in some sense, including the mind, including even spirit, if that exists. So an interesting example from theology I'll just mention is in the Latter-day Saint movement, or also known as Mormonism. Joseph Smith Jr., he had a materialist outlook for a lot of things that would generally fall within the supernatural domain. So he said all spirit is matter, but it is more fine or pure and can only be discerned by purer eyes. We cannot see it, but when our bodies are purified, we shall see that it is all matter. And that's kind of an interesting perspective. It's and I see it pop up in science as well, or in philosophy, in philosophy of science, although maybe expressed in different terms. That one way of breaking all this down is to just consider everything material. Now, this perspective from Joseph Smith still leaves some open questions. For example, he doesn't say that everything is matter. He says all spirit is matter. So that still leaves open the possibility that there are immaterial things. And also it's brings up an interesting question of, is it basically just a matter of where you want to draw your boundaries? So for example, saying all spirit is matter, is that just kind of redefining matter, whereas we can look at something that other people wouldn't want to consider as matter and just say, well, we consider that matter. So is it really a monism where others see a dualism? And basically monism seeing everything as just all one substance. There's no radical divide in two or more kinds of things. Everything's the same type of thing. Whereas dualism, which we'll get into in a little bit, dualism seeing that there are two very different kinds of things, material and immaterial. We could see this type of outlook that Joseph Smith brings up here as a monism that you could still kind of break down into dualistic categories, even if you insist that, okay, really it is all the same type of stuff. And we'll see this similar type of thing happening with Spinoza as well, where you have a monism that still is kind of dualistic, but is like a dualism within inside a monism, which I find kind of an interesting way of breaking things down. So the way that I've been thinking about this recently in my own mind is to make a spectrum. And so if you think of a line going from left to right, we have this spectrum of materiality. So on the left side of that spectrum, we have the obvious stuff. So we got our rocks and tables and chairs. And then as we go over to the right end of the spectrum is where we start getting into stuff that's a little less clear. So, we have our fields and our molecular molecules still seem pretty material. Those are pretty obvious parts of physics. And then we get into the equations. So, well, yeah, they're indispensable to physics. Are they really material? Those are getting a little further to the right. And then on the far right, we have like the mind or the soul, things that maybe we don't necessarily include on the materiality spectrum, but that would be on the far end. And ways of there are different ways we could break this up. One way that I think is interesting is what Wilfrid Sellars, a philosopher, has called the manifest image. So in 1962, he wrote a book called Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. And he distinguished between the manifest image and the scientific image of the world. And that's kind of what I was talking about before with the things that are obvious and the things that we need science and instruments to be able to see. So a manifest image includes things that are in our immediate worldview. So intentions, thoughts, and appearances. The scientific image describes the world in terms of the theoretical physical sciences. So things like causality and theories of particles and forces, things that start to include these models. Now, these two images, sometimes they'll complement each other, sometimes they'll conflict with each other. the manifest image is what's more practical. So it's the practical moral claims. Scientific image doesn't include those things. There is conflict, for example, where science tells us that what seem to be solid objects. So going back to our rocks, tables, and chairs, those are solid objects. My daughter was just asking me the other day if it's possible for to pass through solid objects. And I said, well, not without breaking them. So Sellers favors a synoptic vision where depending on what you're interested in, one can take precedence over the other. So a scientific image can take ultimate precedence in case of conflict when we're talking about empirical descriptions and explanations. Okay, so like if you're talking about, okay, can a wall is solid, can you pass through it without breaking it? Well, no, not for practical purposes. But yes, in our scientific image, most of it is empty space, but still the forces between the two bodies, even though they're empty face, those bodies still oppose each other. So for all practical purposes, they are solid. And I was reading about this in Dennett's book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back. And here are some of the things he says about the manifest image. Quote, "Consider the world we live in, full of other people, plants and animals, furniture and houses and cars, and colors and rainbows and sunsets, and voices and haircuts, and home runs and dollars, and problems and opportunities and mistakes, among many other such things. These are the myriad of things, quote unquote, that are easy for us to recognize, point to, love or hate, and in many cases manipulate or even create. These are the things we use in our daily lives to anchor our interactions and conversations, and to a rough approximation, for every noun in our everyday speech, there is a kind of thing it refers to. That's the sense in which the image is manifest. It is obvious to all, and everybody knows that it is obvious to all, and everybody knows that too. It comes along with your native language. It's the world according to us. Sellers contrasted this with the scientific image, which is populated with molecules, atoms, electrons, gravity, quarks, and who knows what else, dark energy, strings, brains. Even scientists conduct most of their waking lives conceiving of what is going on in terms of the manifest image, close quote. So let's go ahead and use that, this idea of the manifest image and the scientific image, and impose that onto this little spectrum that I've made, the spectrum of materiality. So if we say the manifest image, you can imagine we have on the left end of the spectrum there, we have our rocks, tables, chairs, wind, air. We can make a box around that and say, okay, that's the manifest image. And then further to the right of that, but still, in the middle of the spectrum, we can say we have our molecules, and I'll go ahead and include bacteria in that since we need microscopes for that. But then we have our models of our molecules, and we have our fields and photons, things that we're able to infer from science and able to use in our scientific toolbox. We'll make a box around that and call that the scientific image. And we can look at that and say, okay, these are things. All right. In the one sense, there are things in the manifest image that we work with on a daily basis and have practical uses for and interests in. And then there are things in the scientific image that maybe most of us wouldn't deal with at least consciously, even though they certainly would affect our lives, and the technologies that we use have implications for us. But it's the engineers and scientists who would have these as part of their toolbox of things that they're having to work with, and we can say that these are in scare quotes. So we can say these are things, right? They're things that we're interacting with. Now, if we expand that a little bit more, as getting into the laws of physics and the equations that govern the patterns of nature, okay, are those things, if we expand the box a little bit even further to the right on the spectrum of materiality, are those things, maybe it doesn't matter, but some people might want to say those are things, or some people might want to say, okay, those aren't things, but they're still indispensable. It's hard to say it without things, but they are parts of our view of reality that we need to use to be able to understand it. And so, maybe those are things. Are they material? Well, that's getting back into this question of what do we want to include in our material? How far are we going to extend those boxes? And does material include everything that's in the manifest image? Yes, I would say so. Or does it include everything that's in the scientific image? Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe the scientific image starts to overlap with what would be outside the material, or if we were to say there's a box of immaterial. So let's get into another way of breaking this down between the material and the immaterial. And so I mentioned dualism before. Let's get into that. So René Descartes, he's kind of thought of as the major proponent of dualism in modern philosophy. He was a French philosopher, and he understood of that the mind and the body cannot be equivalent, that they have different properties, and not everything that you can say of one can be said about the other, and that the mind must be something that is immaterial. So we can, on our spectrum of materiality, we can think of this as there's a box around all of the stuff in the manifest image, and in the scientific image, we'll just go ahead and include the laws of physics and in equations and all that stuff for now. But the mind, or we could also say the soul or spirit of the body, that's in a separate box. So that is immaterial. I guess you could say there's a break there, a discrete break on this spectrum of materiality where it's really not material even. It's something else. But there are also other ways we could divvy this up. So thinking of our two boxes along the spectrum here, we have our material box and our immaterial box. Everything's still in the same place along the spectrum, with mind at the far right end of this spectrum. Maybe the immaterial includes more than just that box. Maybe the immaterial also includes the laws of physics and the equations that govern the motions of matter. And we could say that is also an immaterial realm. Or we could expand the immaterial box further. This would probably be a little further than most people would want to do, or most scientists would want to do. But we could say that even our models of fields and waves and photons and certain particles that are more inferred in at least in the way that we model them, that those are also included in the immaterial box. And then I'll get to some other ways of breaking that up. But I want to mention, before moving on, that as far as the mind, there's another way you could deal with it. So in the modern philosophy of mind, there's a position called Eliminative Materialism, which basically is that our ordinary common sense understanding of the mind is wrong. And that the mental phenomena that seem to exist and that we posit by common sense in our folk psychology, as it said, these don't actually exist. So that the mental phenomena such as beliefs and desires do not exist. So we just pull the mind out of that spectrum of materiality altogether and just say, okay, it doesn't exist. It doesn't even have a place there. So we don't even have to worry about that. I'll just mention that in passing. There's definitely some very sophisticated defenses of that position, and I don't want to shortchange it. But I wouldn't say it's one of the mainstream views, and it's not one that I really endorse, but I just want to at least acknowledge that it's one that is out there. But for now, I'm going to say, okay, the mind has to fit in here somewhere, but it's also going to be a little bit of a puzzle where exactly it's going to go. Okay, so going back into our ways of breaking all this down, we could also just put one box around everything, all the way from rocks, tables, and chairs to the mind or even spirit, and just say, okay, get rid of the immaterial box and just put the material box around all of that and say everything is material. Everything that exists is a material thing. This is just a term I made up, inclusive materialism. It's a very expansive materialism where we're not so much denying much, of existence. I mean, it's basically just saying everything that does exist, whatever it may be, is material. Now, we may deny supernatural entities like spirits and angels and or God or things like that, but we could say, well, okay, even if those things do exist, those are also going to be material as well. That it's an all-inclusive box that captures everything in it and classifies it as material. So I wouldn't say that this is a view that I personally hold absolutely. I think it's a possibility, and it's an interesting way of looking at things. So I'd just like to consider it for a little bit for the remainder of this podcast and think, okay, what ideas come up if we consider this inclusive materialist view where whatever there is, it's all part of one type of substance, it's all material. So a few things that come to mind. I want to go back to my spectrum of materiality and think about perception of things, and also the origination of things, how things come about. So I think of it as like two arrows. So on our perception, we definitely start in the realm of the manifest image, right? So I think of the direction of perception as moving from left to right, from the things that are very obviously and clearly material to things that may be a little bit less so obviously material. So moving from our manifest image to our scientific image. So we start off, we know about rocks, tables, and chairs. We know about our own bodies. We know about these macroscopic bodies. And then we use those things to build instruments and to start to understand the world of science. And we start to reflect and to reason, to build models, come up with theories, and start to express these ideas that are less obviously material. They're further on the right end of that spectrum. So that's kind of that direction of perception. Now, is that the way things are actually come about? I think it's possible to think of it the direction of origination, the way things are built up, in the opposite direction, as moving from right to left, so that what we start off with, and you could think of this as what needs to exist, what are the necessary conditions to have the world that we have. So what needed to be there for rocks, tables, and chairs to be around? Well, even though we don't know this in our perception first, rocks, tables, and chairs are made up of molecules and atoms, and those atoms are made up of particles, and those particles are in atomic and molecular orbitals, and all these things are governed by laws. And these laws appear to have been pretty consistent throughout the history of the universe, probably the same, and that they were kind of the underlying framework for all of this. So I think it's possible to think of starting on the most what seems least obviously material side of that spectrum on the far right end, that's what's making all the other things as we move leftward possible. So we have these opposite directions of perception and origination. But then we come up with the question, where does the mind fit into all of this? And I think that depends. Before I had the mind on the far right end of the spectrum, because it seems to be the least material, but that doesn't seem to fit quite obvious into this framework of a direction of perception or a direction of origination. I think you could definitely argue that the mind should be not as far as materiality, but in direction of origination should be on the far left end, along with the rocks, tables, and chairs, right? That all these things in the universe, if we go back to the Big Bang and the conditions that were present there were, at least in one view, there wasn't mind around. There's another view that there was, but we'll say for the moment that there wasn't mind around to be perceiving all these things, but that these things just proceeded, and that we get the fundamental particles, we start getting atoms, we start getting molecules, and then we start getting basic life. We get the microscopic life that we can't even see, but it was there before any other life, and then we start getting the macroscopic things that we can see, and it isn't for a very long time before we actually start getting a conscious and self-conscious mind. So that would be the direction of origination. Or we could see it alternatively in a very strong idealist view, that the mental is what is most basic, and this would be kind of a Berkeleyan view of George Berkeley, that all that we really have to work with is our mind and the phenomena of our mind. We just infer material things from it, and so the mind is what is most primary, and so you could put the mind back on the far right end of the spectrum of origination that is the source of all these things. And then in that type of world, you might want to rearrange the order of a lot of these things. Not really going to get too much into that, but I just want to at least mention that where the mind fits in the direction of origination of all of this is an interesting question, but a little bit too big to really pursue for now. So going back to this inclusive materialism, a few questions come up. So inclusive materialism, we're again saying, okay, everything is material. Everything that is around is material. Everything that could be said to be a thing is material. So how should we understand this? What is the way we can organize this in our heads and think about it properly? How should we understand this material world? How is it structured? And how does it evolve through time? How does it change? And I think these are important questions because if we're wanting to have an understanding, it's not enough to just say, well, there's all this stuff and it's just there. That doesn't really tell us much in a way of understanding it, right? So a few quotes here from Carl Sagan that are kind of express what I'm thinking here. Carl Sagan, when he talked about the evolution of the universe, he talked about how things change in the universe. It's not just static, but it's an in-between universe. He said we live in an in-between universe where things change, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature. So it's not just stuff, and it's not just a random disarray of stuff that has no coherent order behind it, no reason for stuff being where it is in one moment and then being where it is the next, or being as it is in the next. But there's a pattern behind it, and these are these laws of nature that I was talking about. Another Sagan quote: "The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together." And this is definitely true of living things. I think it's also true just of all things, that structure is really important. Form is important. And that we pay attention to that. It's not just what is there, but we want to see the way that it's organized, the way that it's put together, so that we can get some idea of what its nature is and what we can learn about it. And so we need to pay attention to these kinds of details. And one way that I really like organizing this and thinking about this was a framework developed by Aristotle in his 4 causes. So he identified 4 ways that we can look of the causes of things. So these are the material, formal, efficient, and final causes. So I'll go through those briefly and describe what they are. So the material cause is just what stuff is. And that's what I was talking about. That's the most basic. If you just have a bunch of stuff, obviously necessary, but it doesn't really tell you a whole lot there. And then we have the formal cause. So the formal cause, so material cause is what is it made of, and the formal cause is what is its structure. And that's going back to what Sagan was talking about a bit, that the beauty or the significance of something is in the way that it's put together. It's not just the atoms that go into it, but the way that it's put together. So that's getting into that formal cause. So second, we have the efficient cause. How did it get started? What was it that initiated this process? And that's definitely important for many reasons. And then the fourth is the final cause. A final cause is, what is it for? What is its purpose? Now, these have a rich history in classical thought, going that have been used by scholars for hundreds of years. But one narrative of the history of Western thought is that Aristotelian thought has kind of been dethroned from its prominence in many ways. And in certain ways, that's definitely legitimate, because Aristotle, in many of his factual statements, was incorrect in many things. And Francis Bacon also looked at these four causes and thought, especially of the final cause, that that's not really something that has a place in science anymore. I want to bring in a quote here from Daniel Dennett, and this is, again, from his book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back. He has a little bit more of a complicated view on looking at these final causes. So one way this is often referred to is in the Greek term telos, and this is where we get the term teleology, which is a study of the purposes of things, purposes and ends of things. So here's quoting Dennett, quote, "The Greek for the fourth cause is telos, from which we derive the term teleology. Science, we are often told, has banished the telos. On the one hand, biologists routinely and ubiquitously refer to the functions of behaviors such as foraging and territory marking, organs such as eyes and swim bladders, subcellular machinery such as ribosomes, chemical cycles such as the Krebs cycle, and macromolecules such as the motor proteins and hemoglobin. But some thoughtful biologists and philosophers of biology are uneasy about these claims and insist that all this talk of function and purposes is really only shorthand, a handy metaphor, and that, strictly speaking, there are no such things as functions, no purposes, no teleology at all in the world. So seductive is the lure of Cartesian thinking that in order to resist it, some think we should follow the abstemious principle that whenever there is any risk of infection by pre-scientific concepts of souls and spirits, Aristotelian teleology and the like, it is best to err on the side of squeaky clean, absolute quarantine." And then Dennett says, "I disagree with this overkill austerity." Close quote. So this is one perspective that Dennett's setting out here, is that since we're kind of scared of this pre-scientific baggage that comes with Aristotle, and that he's thought to be more archaic and outdated, and this idea that there really are causes, that there really are purposes in nature and functions and purposes for things, that's an older way of thinking, and that it's ascribing too much of an intelligent and purposeful order to nature and to reality. But Dennett pushes back on this, and even though Dennett is he's secular, he's an atheist, he's a materialist, he doesn't think that such an abstemious principle, this kind of extreme austerity, is really called for. That it's kind of overkill, and that if we're careful in our thinking, that it's okay to permit some of this telos back into our thinking. So here's another quote from him. Quote, "The biosphere is utterly saturated with design, with purpose, with reasons. What I call the design stance predicts and explains features throughout the living world using the same assumptions that work so well when reverse engineering artifacts made by somewhat intelligent human designers," and somewhat there in parentheses is being kind of funny there. So this is basically saying we can reverse engineer a lot of what we see in nature. And if we can do that, there's at least a stance that we can take, maybe an as-if type of stance, that there's design in nature. And even if we don't want to say that there was a conscious being behind it designing, I don't really mind saying that, but if Dennett and others don't want to say that, we could say that there is structure in nature as if it were designed, and that things operate in such a way as if they were designed. So here's another quote from him along these same lines. Quote, There were reasons long before there were reason representers, us. The reasons tracked by evolution I have called free-floating rationales, a term that has apparently jangled the nerves of some few thinkers who suspect I am conjuring up ghosts of some sort. Not at all. Free-floating rationales are no more ghostly or problematic than numbers or centers of gravity. Cubes had 8 corners before people invented ways of articulating arithmetic, and asteroids had centers of gravity before there were physicists to dream up the idea and calculate with it. Reasons existed long before there were reasoners. Some find this way of thinking unnerving and problematically unsound, but I am not relenting. Instead, I am hoping here to calm their fears and convince them that we should all be happy to speak of reasons uncovered by evolution long before they were ever expressed or represented by human investigators of the human minds, investigators or any other minds, close quote. And that's also from Bacteria to Bach and back. Okay, so to comment a little bit on this is something I've thought about quite a bit too, and I'm glad to see that Dennett stated it in this way. So evolution by natural selection, interestingly enough, it's been thought to have banished telos and purpose, but in a way, evolution by natural selection has to have that. So if we think of natural selection, the idea being that certain organisms, if they have attributes that are not fit for their environment, they're not going to survive. And if they do have certain mutations that cause features and phenotypes that are going to be advantageous, then those are going to outcompete. Those are going to thrive in their environments. And so you're going to get these allele frequencies shifting towards these advantageous phenotypes. Now, what that means is that it relies on there being some type of free-floating purpose. So to these features. So I think about a bird's wings. What is a bird's wing for? Well, it's for flying in most cases, although some other birds have made different uses for them. But say a bird needs to fly and it has a wing, and a wing is not that it's defective in some way, that there's some mutation that makes it so that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Well, unless it can find some other use for that, that bird is not going to really thrive in its environment. It's probably going to die, especially if there are predators around that require flying. Or what is a heart for? A heart is for pumping blood. If a heart is not functioning properly and it's not pumping blood, that organism is not going to survive, and any mutation that led to that is not going to persist in the population. And so this framework of natural selection really does require this view, at least after the fact view, when we come on the scene to look at it and reverse engineer it, that yeah, there are purposes for these components, and that if they don't work properly, then there's going to be a big problem. So I think Dennett's on the right track here, that there are definitely free-floating rationales and purposes in nature. And actually, one of the things that got me started thinking along these lines quite a while ago was another one of Dennett's books, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which is much older. In that book, basically he says Darwin's dangerous idea is that there are certain processes that pop up all over the place, but he uses evolution by natural selection as one major example, where there is apparent design that doesn't require a designer, but that there are things and processes that can progress algorithmically. So the algorithm is his big idea in this book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. So I want to talk a little bit about that, about the algorithmic process. So Dennett describes evolution by natural selection as an algorithmic process. And he says, an algorithm is a certain sort of formal process that can be counted on logically to yield a certain sort of result whenever it is run or instantiated. So an example he gives is long division, that long division has a certain set of steps, and you take these inputs, they go through your algorithm, and then they spit out a certain result. And there are all kinds of algorithms of this sort. Now, he lists three key features of algorithms that he sees as being significant for this dangerous idea, as he calls it. So the three key features that he lists are substrate neutrality, underlying mindlessness, and guaranteed results. I'll just mention briefly substrate neutrality being that you can operate these algorithms on various systems. So a computer built of different types of materials, or a computer that it could be built of silicon, or it could be something that's done on paper, or it could be done with an abacus, or I don't know, but various substrates that you can use for these types of algorithms. But the main one I want to talk about is the underlying mindlessness, because that was kind of his point of this book, and that's the thing that's dangerous. And he says, I'll quote from Darwin's Dangerous Idea here, quote, "Although the overall design of the procedure may be brilliant or yield brilliant results, each constituent step, as well as the transition between steps, is utterly simple." How simple? Simple enough for a dutiful idiot to perform, or for a straightforward mechanical device to perform. A tedious breakdown of the process into dead simple steps requires no wise decisions or delicate judgments or intuitions. No matter how impressive the products of an algorithm, the underlying process always consists of nothing but a set of individually mindless steps succeeding each other without the help of any intelligent supervision. They are automatic, or by definitions, the working of an automaton. Close quote. So how does this work in nature? I think in natural selection, there's definitely a macroscopic level where things are happening, that there's proliferation, diversification, mutation, and there's a limitation on resources, and there are these different steps. That's at a macroscopic scale. I like to think at the being a chemist, I like to think also at the biochemical level. He gives an example, or kind of a broad example, in his book From Bacteria to Bach and Back. I'll quote that. Quote, the prebiotic or abiotic world was not utter chaos, a random confetti of atoms in motion. In particular, there were cycles. At many spatiotemporal scales, seasons, night and day, tides, the water cycle, and thousands of chemical cycles discoverable at the atomic and molecular level. Think of cycles as do loops in algorithms, actions that return to a starting point after accomplishing something, accumulating something, or moving something, or sorting something, for instance, and then repeating and repeating and repeating, gradually changing the conditions in the world and thus raising the probability that something new will happen. Okay, so on Earth, just by virtue of the Earth's orbit, the Earth's rotation, there are cycles, dynamic processes, and these occur also on a chemical level. And so we can think of these as do loops, as processes that are happening over and over again, and that those work out as effectively as algorithms, even though these aren't the types of algorithms that we would design in a computer program or write down on paper to perform a mathematical process. It's still an algorithm of sorts. So in the materialist framework, if we're going back to this spectrum of materiality that I drew up before, and then we have the box covering all of it for materialism, where do algorithms fit into that? I think they can fit into that. And I won't get into exactly where they would fit in at the moment, but it's something to think about that they're definitely not the same types of things as rocks, tables, and chairs, right? But if you're going to have algorithms in your materialist ontology, you have to think about the way that is going to fit into it, because it is indispensable for a coherent understanding of this materialist world. And this brings me to something that I find very interesting, which is how to have a coherent materialism, because I think you can. I think it is definitely possible, but it has to be, there are certain things that need to be accounted for to make the whole thing work and to make sense. And what I like about this idea of what Dennett was bringing up with the way that nature has purposes and functions and algorithmic processes in them, is that not only can we hopefully fit these algorithms and other things that are on the far end of the materiality spectrum, not only can we fit these things into a materialist ontology, we basically have to do it. We have to fit them in. Or else everything doesn't make sense. It's just going to be a jumble. And so evolution not only permits teleology, as Dennett notes, and I think argues quite persuasively, it basically requires it. It doesn't make any sense for there to be a selection process for the organisms with the fittest phenotypes for a certain environment if there's no such thing as fitness or function or purpose that you can map on to that whole process. It requires that teleology. The things that are on that far right end of the spectrum of materiality, these are the things that give order and coherence to the things that are more firmly material things in our manifest image, like our rocks, tables, and chairs. Those things require the more tenuous or rarefied material things in our ontology to be intelligible. And I think of this as materialism saving grace. Even though these things may be a little bit unwelcome or a little bit out of place seemingly, I think I like to shift the perspective on that and see that these are actually things that we need to have. And just as an extreme example, if we were to banish entirely from our outlook here, if we were to get rid of some of those things on the far right end of the spectrum, if we were to get rid of the laws of physics, if we were to get rid of the fundamental equations that govern the progression and evolution of the natural world, if we were to get rid of the things that are more on the model side of things, if we were to get rid of fields and our models of the atomic scale, there wouldn't be any sense to the rest of it. It would just seem to be a random, chaotic mess. But what we have in science, the reason that we have all of these models and these structures that aren't as obviously in the manifest image sense of material, we have those things, and they do provide that order and structure. And this brings me to the second of those authors that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Elizabeth Grosz. I'll start out with a quote from her that basically restates what I was just saying. Quote, "Without ideality, a plan, a map, a model, an ideal, a direction, or a theme, materiality could not materialize itself." Close quote. And then another quote from her. Quote, "Ideality opens materiality up not just as the collectivity or totality of things, but as a cohesive, meaningful world." Close quote. Okay, and I like that part there where she's kind of contrasting this other notion of it just being a collectivity or totality, but just a collectivity or totality, a random collocation of atoms, as sometimes I've heard it described, wouldn't be very meaningful. It wouldn't be very cohesive. But ideality or brings some order to all of this. And these are from her book. The book I read of hers is called The Incorporeal Ontology, Ethics, and the Limits of Materialism. I found this because I was interested in the limitations of materialism, not so much to undermine materialism, but just kind of to think seriously about it, and to look at its potential weak spots and see if we could shore those up a little bit, to make an account of materialism that covers up those weak spots. So what she does is she's a materialist, but she pursues what she calls the incorporeal, which she defines as the subsistence of the ideal in the material or corporeal. So even though things are material, they are corporeal, there are these aspects to them that are incorporeal. And this is getting a little way of saying, okay, are they things? Are they material things? She's kind of looking at this in a different way. She's saying, okay, let's call this this aspect of things the incorporeal. And so I'll just run with that for a little bit, since that's the way she frames it in her book. Her book, The Incorporeal, is an exploration of the incorporeal conditions of corporeality, the excesses beyond and within corporeality that frame, orient, and direct material things and processes. And then another quote from her. Every materialism requires a frame, a non-material localization, a becoming space and time that cannot exist in the same way and with the same form as the objects or things that they frame. Every materialism, whether this is acknowledged openly or not, requires an incorporeal frame. So that's a pretty strong claim. And I'd have to say, it does seem to be right, at least if we're saying, even if on our spectrum of materiality, it's all material, there's at least a spectrum, right? So there is some, we do make some distinctions, and we see that there are some differences in the materiality or extent of materiality in all these things. That it's not just all of identical materiality. So if we were to just chop it up a little bit, she's saying there is this part that's incorporeal and that is necessary, which is kind of the point I was making earlier, that you have to have those parts on the right end of the spectrum to be able to make sense of the rest. Okay, another quote from her. Quote, ideality frames, directs, and makes meaning from materiality. Materiality carries ideality and is never free of the incorporeal forms that constitute and orient it as material. It is this condition that I aim to explore, using the genealogy I have indicated, a way to conceptualize materiality without reducing its ideal dimension. Close quote. So Grosz describes the incorporeal not as transcending the corporeal, but being immanent in it. And to make a theological comparison, there are two ways that are possible of thinking about God. One is that God transcends the universe, so he's basically not part of it. And then there's also an immanent way of seeing that God is basically connected with the universe in some immanent way. And this could be looked at in again, it's hard to say that there's when you start zooming into the details that there really is a clean separation between these two ideas. Because there does seem to be, even in transcendent views of God, there are ways that God pervades, that his spirit and influence pervades all of materiality as well. So that I see them more as kind of two aspects, or two ways of looking at the same thing. But immanence basically being that it's here around us. So she traces a philosophical genealogy of this incorporeal immanence in corporeal thought through various philosophical figures. So the Stoics as a group, through Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Deleuze. I'm going to focus mostly on Spinoza here, because I think Spinoza has a very intriguing and useful way of breaking things down. If we look at the whole, once again, the spectrum with the box covering all of it for the marking it out as material, this is a model of the whole. We have this totality. How should we break it all down and organize it in our thinking? And I think Spinoza has a good way of doing this. So let's go ahead and introduce Spinoza here. So this is Baruch Spinoza. His dates are 1632 to 1677. He was Dutch, but of Portuguese and Sephardic Jewish origin. So back in these times, Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, both in Spain and in Portugal, and so they had to go elsewhere. And so his family had ended up in the Netherlands, and so he was Jewish, but very much secularized, and he was also excommunicated from his community for some of his views, which, as you will see, are kind of unorthodox, definitely. Elizabeth Grosz called Spinoza the philosopher of immanence, and reason for that being he's even though he's sometimes described as an atheist, he would not consider himself that way. He saw everything as theistic. So basically, he's a monist, so he sees reality as comprised of one substance, and that substance he actually identifies with God. And so it's different from the orthodox views in Judaism or Christianity, but very much God-saturated still. So his model of reality, let's look at his metaphysics. Spinoza breaks reality down into three major categories, and these are the big three to remember from his thought. So we have substance, attributes, and modes. Now, I mentioned there's only one substance, so everything emanates from this substance. And this, there are definitely religious parallels to this. We could think of a Neoplatonic thought where there are emanations from the one, and that's also that was also a philosophical model, but also has definitely religious a religious aspect to it as well. And I would say the same is also true with Spinoza. So God is this one substance, and then there are myriad attributes that emanate from God, and then from each of these attributes there are also modal manifestations. There are modes that are individual manifestations of God's attributes. So I'll talk about this a little bit more. First, a quote from Ethics. This is Spinoza's major work, for which he's most well known. So, quote, "Particular things are nothing but affections of God's attributes, or modes by which God's attributes are expressed in a certain and determinate way." Close quote. Okay, so basically, you could think of everything as being part of God, because God is the one single substance. But of course, there are many, many things in reality, and so there has to be some way of breaking this up, and that's done through these three categories of substance, attributes, and modes. And so, individual things are modes. Individual people are mode. Individual objects are modes, but they are part of the whole. And so even if Spinoza's understanding of reality is monist, and that it's all part of one boundary, there are still distinctions. So Elizabeth Grosz, she says, Spinoza offers a way out of dualism, but only on condition that the relation is entirely reconceived, by being more dualist, by taking dualism to its limits. And this is kind of similar to something I was thinking about Joseph Smith earlier, where Joseph Smith was talking about how all spirit is matter. But there still is this distinction between body and spirit, right? We don't get rid of that distinction just because it's all matter. So we're basically moving what we call matter up a level so that it encompasses these earlier distinctions. So it's not that there are no longer distinctions between individual objects or even types of objects, but that they fall under this one umbrella that maybe we could say is moved up a higher level than we might normally have thought of thinking of things. So you could say there's one substance, then within the substance there are various attributes, and then each attribute breaks down into various modes of individual manifestation. In Spinoza's thought, there are multiple attributes, but there are only two that we know about. Others we just may not be capable of accessing, but we have no reason to think that there are only these two. So the two attributes that Spinoza sees coming from the one substance, God, are extension and thought. So extension basically being what would be on that far left end of the materiality spectrum. So these are rocks, tables, and chairs, and objects that populate our universe. And then there's thought. So that's the mental. And these two operate in parallel, and they still both come from the one substance. So they're not radically separate in any major ontologically significant way. And then, so from the attribute of extension, we get modes, which are objects. These would be the bodies of individuals. And then from the attribute of thought, we would get modes as well, which would be individual minds. So my mind is a mode of the attribute of thought. My body is a mode of the attribute of extension. So that's kind of an interesting way of breaking it up. It's one possible model. It reminds me a little bit of another kind of holistic model proposed by Roger Penrose. In his view of reality, he sees these three different worlds that, to varying degrees, encompass one another. So there's a physical world, there's a mental world, and then there's a Platonic mathematical world. And so the Platonic mathematical world would be all these different mathematical structures that could be possible. Only a portion of them are actualized in the physical world. We could say they're corporealized. And so the physical world behaves according to these mathematical structures, these laws, these mathematical equations. And then some of those things in the physical world also become mental. And not all things, of course. Most things are not animate, and even things that are animate may not be mental, but there are some mental things. And then a small subset of the mental world is able to access, once again, the Platonic mathematical world, in which we're able to see these ordered structures in nature. And I just think that's another interesting model. I'd just throw that out there to consider alongside Spinoza's model of the whole. I'd like to talk now about some of the theological and religious implications of some of these things that we've been talking about. So we've talked about things that are incorporeal, immaterial, versus corporeal and material. These, I think, can map on quite naturally to concepts of body and spirit, whether we conceive of those under one monist umbrella, or in terms where all spirit is matter. There's definitely affinities in both types of terms. So religious interpretations are not required for any of these. I think they can be spoken of in wholly secular terms. There's been a development of that track, but they are possible, and that shouldn't be too surprising, because a lot of this goes back to a history where so, for example, the concept of Greek philosophy in a certain way was very spiritual, and a lot of the philosophy developed in religious contexts, where these weren't really separated. And so I want to talk about some of these implications. So terms like incorporeal mind can also project onto religious notions like spirit and soul. And I think this can help with once again, going back to a coherent materialism, a religious outlook can accommodate a thoroughgoing materialism or an inclusive materialism. So going back to what Joseph Smith said, all spirit is matter. What is a way that we could make sense of that? For a coherent kind of monism, we're going to have include things like form and purpose. So I'll bring in one theologian here, David Bentley Hart. He said, as a purely practical matter, physical science has never been able to proceed very far without some reference to form or finality. Both may be excluded from consideration as objectively real causal agencies for ideological reasons, but both still retain an indispensable interpretive power for making sense of the objects of scientific analysis. And this goes back to those directions of perception and origination that at a certain point, yes, we perceive first the things that are most immediate in our manifest image. But as we start looking closer, we start to perceive more that we have to develop more models into our scientific worldview to explain the things around us. And that as a matter of origination of things that are necessary and prior conditions for the world that we see around us, there have to be these other ideas, these laws and patterns in nature to make sense of the physical sciences and of the material world. And I'll bring in Daniel Dennett here again. I quoted this already, but I think he makes much the same point as David Bentley Hart makes here. Just quoting from Dennett again, the biosphere is utterly saturated with design, with purpose, with reasons. What I call the design stance predicts and explains features throughout the living world using the same assumptions that work so well when reverse engineering artifacts made by somewhat intelligent human designers. So the purpose and reasons are definitely necessary features of our reality. I'll bring in Hart again, a quote from him, quote, "In the end, pure induction is a fantasy. The human mind could never arrive at an understanding of reality simply by sorting through its collections of bare sense impressions of particulars, trying to arrange them into intelligible and reiterative patterns. It must begin the work of interpretation at even the most elementary levels by attempting to impose some kind of purposive meaning upon each datum." Close quote. So going back to what I was talking about with, if we think of just Aristotle's material cause, that doesn't get us very far. I mean, it's just a collection of stuff. We need to think of it in some way that makes sense of it and orders it. Now, Hart is a scholar of the early patristic scholars of early Christianity, and also, I believe, of medieval scholastic scholars as well, the scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas. And one of the ideas that we see in these earlier theologians, and I would say especially pre-Reformation, is that in the classical notions of nature and grace, God's creative activity isn't separate from nature. It's very immanent. And that's why I was saying before, there's not really a clean break between transcendence and immanence here. God's creative activity isn't separate from nature, but suffuses it and continually sustains it. And this is an idea we see especially in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Later with William of Ockham and his ideas kind of developed later in the Reformation, there's this absolute sovereignty of God and this mysterious unknowability of God that, we can never understand his purposes and his will. But before that, there was more an idea that, well, God's activity is seen throughout nature, and so it is possible to understand God to a certain extent by nature because his spirit is immanent in it. Another quote from Hart: "The classical theological arguments regarding the order of the world assume that God's creative power can be seen in the rational coherence of nature as a perfect whole, that the universe was not simply the factitious product of a supreme intellect, but the unfolding of an omnipresent divine wisdom or logos. For Thomas Aquinas, for instance, God creates the order of nature by infusing the things of the universe with the wonderful power of moving of themselves toward determinate ends." Now, this may all sound very abstract, and we may wonder, okay, why does this matter? What does this have to do with any of the things that we've been talking about, or why should we care about this? I'll try to make a case for that. As far as God being immanent in creation and having this continual sustaining power and presence in it, I think this has implications for the way that we understand creation and intelligent design. So I'm actually not opposed to the idea of intelligent design. I mean, obviously I'm a theist, and I think that God is the ultimate source of all things, and certainly is the ultimate power behind creation. So in a certain sense, you could say I'm a proponent of intelligent design understood broadly. However, I'm not necessarily on board with, or convinced, I should say. I'm not necessarily convinced by the idea that intelligent design is an episode of periodic interruptions into the order of reality where things can only be explained by a mysterious working of God in nature. So if there's some molecular structure that's so complex that there's no way it could have arisen from the order of nature that God has to come in and tinker with it to fix it up. I'm not persuaded that that's the case, and part of that's mostly a theological view. I mean, certainly there's mystery, right? We don't understand how a lot of things in nature did arise. There definitely are a lot of gaps in our knowledge of evolution and the development of life, or in the order of nature. I mean, that's why we have a whole discipline of science. However, I'm inclined to think that nature is rationally ordered by God in such a way that it basically proceeds on its own, but on its own, meaning that it's all one. It's part of God's activity. Everything is part of God's activity. So in a way, we could look at it, and it's self-consistent, self-contained. So what would intelligent design look like under this conception of divinity, where God's not separate from nature, but God's grace infuses nature? Okay, so I'll bring in David Bentley Hart again. Quote, according to the classical arguments, universal rational order, not just this or that particular instance of complexity, is what speaks of the divine mind. A cosmic harmony as resplendently evident in the simplicity of a raindrop as in the molecular labyrinths of a living cell. After all, there may be innumerable finite causes of complexity, but a good argument can be made that only a single infinite cause can account for perfect, universal, intelligible, mathematically describable order. And I'll pause there for a second. I want to just mention in the sciences, usually we're trying to find models and explanations that can explain more. So a really good theory will predict things that we didn't even know we needed to predict, or we want to take multiple equations and reduce them down to one equation that can explain multiple phenomena. And the ultimate vision being a grand unified theory where maybe one theory can explain all of physics, or we could derive all of physics from one theory or from one equation. So there's this economy that we seek after. And so that's... I think what Hart is after here when he's saying a good argument can be made that only a single infinite cause can account for perfect, universal, intelligible, mathematically describable order, rather than a series of multiple episodes, which is kind of the more common view of intelligent design. Okay, I'll quote Hart again. Quote, if one could really show that there were interruptions in that order, places where the adventitious intrusions of an organizing hand were needed to correct this or that part of the process, that might well suggest some deficiency in the fabric of creation. It might suggest that the universe was the work of a very powerful, but also somewhat limited designer. It certainly would not show that the universe is the creature of an omnipotent wisdom or an immediate manifestation of God, who is the being of all things. Frankly, the total absence of a single instance of irreducible complexity would be a far more forceful argument in favor of God's rational action in creation. Close quote. So in this case, under this conception of God as not really a demiurge or somebody who's working on a machine in periodic episodes, but as the source of all things, the emanating power infusing all of reality, in that case, what would be most evidence of that would be coherence of the rational order, that it would seem, in a sense, to be self-contained and self-generating. In that case, you would expect to be able to eliminate those gaps in the theory, and that they would be explainable in terms of the system and of our theories. That would be evidence for this classical conception of God, and I think there are some similarities here to the Spinozist view as well, that there's this unity to creation, that all of the modes and particular instances of reality ultimately emanate from this one source. So we could ask, who's right in all this? We can look at my spectrum of materiality and the different boxes and ways of dividing it up, and think, okay, what's the right way? Is Descartes right with his dualism, or is Spinoza right with his monism? Is it right to think that there are two very ontologically distinct types of substances dividing up reality, or is it all one type of substance? I don't know. I think there are advantages for different purposes of dividing things up in certain ways. I tend to approach things in terms of models and approach it pragmatically and thinking of what is it that you're trying to do. I think it's certainly true that there are these things that populate our world and that we see them, and that we have to organize them in certain ways to make sense of them. And there's definitely an underlying reality to that. But I don't know, maybe there are multiple ways to divide this up, and we can approach it at different times in different ways, depending on what it is that we're trying to explain and what we're after. All right, I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for listening. If you made it through the whole episode, I enjoyed going through these topics that I've been reading about and putting the content together. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.